Today we are going to talk about deception, and we're going to talk about deception in the context of cybersecurity, obviously, because we are at a security conference. And to get it right out of the way, I want to lay out why in the world you should care about deception. And I am not going to be talking about honeypots. There's a lot of crap out there about honeypots. We're going to be talking more about deception as a strategy, as a concept or a technique of resiliency engineering. And so in a lot of cases, deception is very much has its roots in offensive maneuvers, offensive techniques, tactics, procedures. And anyone who is familiar with deception techniques is probably familiar with the art of war, good old Sun Tzu, where he says all warfare in some form or fashion is based on deception. And if you read through this little snippet from the art of war, I'm going to try not to knock my head on these lights as I pace around. If you read through this snippet, you'll see it's very much focused on attacks. It's about feigning weakness. It's about using misdirection in some cases. It's about making the enemy believe something that is not actually true, confusing them regarding state. So historically, deception is very much heavily focused on offensive maneuvers. And I don't actually believe that that has to be the case. There's a lot of things that if you study deception, study the way that Western military, political, technology powers or organizations utilize deception, and Eastern same sorts of organizations utilize deception. There's a lot of things that we can take and apply in a defensive context. And so I hit on this really quickly in the beginning around why you should care, but why would we want to deceive? We deceive to gain the advantage back in our favor in some form or fashion. We deceive to build more resilient infrastructures, to build more resilient environments. We don't just deceive to block and find IP addresses to use the banhammer on. At least we shouldn't be. And so I think it falls into two main buckets as to why, as a defender, we would want to deceive. We either want to learn something about the environment that we've been entrusted to defend, or we want to instigate and control we want to effect change over that environment that we have been trusted to defend. And so these are a few things. Again, I'm not going to just read through bullet points. I'm not a fan of that approach. And all of these slides will be available, so you'll have all of that stuff as reference points should you care to read through it. But we want to learn about who's interacting with our environment, how they're interacting with our environment, and how those things change over time. An adversary there's a lot of different pressures and things happening as they're working their way through an environment towards some set of assets that they're trying to extract from you or extract from the organizations that they're targeting. And so deception is a mechanism that we can use to learn about how their tactics change as they're moving. And then from an instigate and control change perspective, we can disrupt, delay, we can screw with the OODA loops that they're working their way through, and we can force them to misappropriate the resources that they have available to them. And I believe that if we think about deception from a strategic capacity, learning can influence change can influence learning, and it can be a nice little loop that we ourselves operate through and step through to really swing the advantage back in our favor. So I didn't actually introduce myself. Really quickly, my name is Robert Wood. I work at a company called SourceClear. I'm the Chief Security Officer there. We don't do anything regarding deception technology. This is not a vendor pitch in any way, shape, or form. I am Washington, D.C. based, and for a long, long time, I have been a huge dork when it comes to military affairs, politics, the world of intelligence. I love reading about deception stuff, and hearing deception vendor pitches drives me up the wall. And so this talk was kind of born out of that frustration and that passion of mine. And so this is basically like an organized and Prezi-fied brain dump, if you will. I do have a background in red teaming, so trying to think outside the box and go all matrix. There is no spoon on a system, and that is me in a nutshell. And I'm a huge Batman fan. So Really quickly, and this is going to kind of set the tone for how we should think about deception or the various techniques that that we'll talk about through this talk. Is anyone here familiar with Mark Metesky? Show of hands. Not one person. All right, so Mark Metesky, is anyone familiar with the Red Team Journal? Anyone read it? Anything? All right, so a few people. The Red Team Journal, fantastic online resource, basically walks through all of these more strategic, higher level concepts as it pertains to red teaming. And he put out some research a while ago that described 3 different states of deception in any form of conflict. The first is when 2 opponents or n number of opponents are going head to head and there is no deception. They're playing above board. The second is the con, where one side is actively trying to deceive the other. That might be, sending spoofed emails. That might be using some form of misdirection. Whatever it is, the target of the deception doesn't actually know that deception is afoot. And then to get a little bit more meta, the hypercon, in his language and taxonomy, is when the target of the deception knows deception is at play, but the deceiver does not know that the target knows, And so you can follow this and be a little bit more meta until you could go a little bit deeper and continue this train, but for our purposes, these 3 states will suffice. So keep these in the back of your head, and I'll reference them throughout the talk. So deception techniques today. We have things like honeypots. We are starting to do honey things. We're creating more honey stuff throughout our organization. So honey tokens and honey passwords and honey accounts and stuff like that. We're starting to, we have moving target deployments. So HashiCorp has their Nomad framework. There's some other tools out there that let you take a single deployment, set of deployment or system deployment infrastructure, and then deploy it to different bits of infrastructure on a randomized cadence or on a predictable cadence. And then there's sandboxing, which is kind of the bee's knees in terms of deception technologies today on the market. And so that is where if you hit one of these honey tripwires, they will send you into some black hole and then just watch what you do and give you some weird looking web page to interact with, and then they'll extract a bunch of TTPs from it, and then they will give you their IP address or some sort of mechanism to identify and fingerprint that attacker, and then they will let you take the banhammer and boot them out of your environment. So based on the way that these sort of technologies are presented to adversaries, having done red teaming and come across some of these things, this falls very much into the hypercon bucket, where we are trying to actively deceive our target. The adversary in this case knows that deception is afoot, but we are completely blinded to it because we've signed a check and we've implemented something, and we've got sunken cost fallacy going on, and we're confident in the sense that we've implemented this thing, and it is elevating our resiliency to these adversaries. And I don't think that's good enough. So we want to get out of the hypercon state unless we are intentionally going there. And actually, we'd probably want to go the next meta level down, where they think we know, but they think we don't know, but we really know. And so I think deception from the defensive perspective struggles in many cases because so frequently we are operating in that hypercon state where we are presenting very elementary kind of interfaces to these adversaries. Like if you look at some of these sandboxing tools that are on the market, you're interfacing with a web page, you hit some URL, and then you go somewhere else, you're automatically redirected somewhere else that doesn't even look like the web page that you were just on, and it has some like set of standard basic functionality that you can kind of click through, and it'll kind of capture all your network traffic, that kind of stuff. And it's fairly obvious that you've walked over some tripwire, or if anyone's ever interacted with a honeypot where you're doing a port scan and you stumble across those systems that have thousands of ports open, and it's like, well, this company is either doing things really freewheeling, or that's probably a honeypot. And and we have confidence in these honeypots that we're putting out, or these honey X things that we're putting out. And so, so I believe most of this, or my working theory, is that most of the deception technologies on the market today, or just in general today, struggle because we're falling unintentionally into that hypercon state. So, moving on, I'm sure folks here are familiar with the kill chain framework, and this is one of the two ways that I want to kind of encourage folks to think through this problem and how we instrument and strategically apply deception in our environments. And so adversaries, when they are attempting to get something out of, extract some value out of our organizations, they will work through a basic process that flows like this. It is not necessarily linear in this way. They will, they might do a little bit of recon, get to the weaponization, find something else. They'll go back to recon, do some more, and then continue on. So it is not just a linear thing. It is more of a constant cycle. And then within that, we have these things called OODA loops, not to be confused with like udon noodles. An OODA loop, for anyone who is not familiar with the term, it is an acronym that was developed by this Air Force pilot named John Boyd back in the day. And it stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. And the theory behind it was, as an Air Force pilot, if I can survey the environment that I'm in, assess the data that I've just collected, make a decision, and then act on that decision, rinse and repeat. Once I act, the state has changed, and there's going to be new info to collect. And so the faster that anyone can cycle through that OODA loop, they will be successful. And the Air Force did a lot of testing in this, and from a pilot perspective, and found that to be pretty consistently true. And I believe that just in general, if for somebody who is actively experimenting, they're going through a very similar process, even if they don't sit down and sit in their computer chair and say like, I'm at this stage of my OODA loop and I need to go here, here, and here, and here. They're going through a process where they're surveying the environment, they're gathering in data, they're creating insight or intelligence out of that, they're making decisions, they're acting on those decisions, and they're cycling, they're iterating, very much like we might do if we're trying to take a product to market or something like that. So the more that we take these traditionally held responses to the insight that we're getting out of deception technologies, such as blocking somebody, such as banning them, such as doing the trap and trace sort of things, when we are applying or instrumenting technologies that fall into that hypercon state, I believe we are doing that. The more we do that, we are allowing an adversary to fail. And the more that we allow our adversaries to fail, the more that they can learn, because every single time they go through that OODA loop, they're learning something new. The state has changed. And in cybersecurity, unlike traditional symmetric warfare, cybersecurity is fascinating because there's almost no consequences. If somebody comes after your organization and they get blocked, they can just boot up a new VM, cycle through some new Tor node, and go at it again. If they want to come after your organization, there's really no consequences stopping them from doing that. There's not a lot of political kinetic response that governments can take. They're trying to sort all this stuff out, but Congress is trying to keep the lights on, and so we're a ways off from being able to deal with things like this. So c'est la vie. So the more an adversary can fail, the more that they can learn, and the more that they can learn, the more dangerous that they get every single time that they learn. And so if an adversary is continuously going through an environment, continuously running up against a wall, in some sort of predictable way, then they're gonna eventually figure out, even if they hit your honeypot a few different times, they're gonna eventually figure out that it is a honeypot. It's not going in a different place. The tripwire isn't necessarily changing, and so now they know that that's a honeypot, and now they can go do something else, or they can potentially just smoke screen you and then go do something else. And you could imagine this in an age of machine learning backed technology, where the more cycles that you can go through. Consider the model AlphaGo that trained itself through a number of computer simulations to beat some of the world champions in Go. Same thing happened with I think it was AlphaZero, Google's chess playing AI. the more simulations that it went through and the more times that it figured out how to get its butt whooped in the games of chess or Go, the better that it got over time. And so, I have a working hypothesis that this is going to get worse and worse and worse if we continue to apply deception in these predictable hyperconst state ways. And so I'm going to go on a mild, quick rant on failure, because I think failure is something that it's kind of a heavy word. Like, nobody likes to fail. It scares some people, and especially in our industry, I think we have a very unhealthy relationship with failure. So I'm currently a chief security officer. There's a saying about chief security officers that they are hired to be fired. I might be asking some of you in a couple of years for a new job. I hope not, but or if you're hiring or anything. But as an industry, and I think application security as a subset of the overall security industry is actually paving the way and trying to set a new tone about culture around failure, which I think is really, really inspiring, and I love it. Like this whole DevSecOps, DevOps integration, just AppSec in general. We are more focused on empowerment and learning from failure and blameless postmortems, things like that, than we are blaming everyone. But it started off, we were still very much blaming developers for introducing SQL injections and not updating their libraries and things like that. And so I pulled up a couple completely non-security related industries or companies, whatever, entities that have both a healthy relationship and a not so healthy relationship with failure. And I want to talk about why that is really, really quickly. So the airline industry, for example, they have 2 black boxes on every flight. When things hit the fan on any flight, so for instance, when I landed here in LAX, our back flap was not opening properly, and we had to pull off when we were trying to land 3 different times, and then they're eventually like, we think we can just slow down, and it's going to be a little fast on the way down, but trust us, it's going to be cool. And we had people rocking themselves and praying to the Holy Ghost and everything as we were landing, and it was it was a little fast and intense, but we made it. I'm here, so but in general, I have every bit of confidence that the airline industry, that Southwest in this case, to their good credit and the airline industry's good credit, they will analyze why that failure occurred, as small as it was, even though it did not end up being a disaster. And they will learn from it. The airline industry has an incredible reputation for constantly adapting their policies, not just within, if American has a bad screw up, they don't keep that learning within American. They shard it out to the entire industry, so the entire industry can grow and learn from everyone else's mistakes, and they get better and more resilient as a result. Dyson vacuums. Well, that seems odd. We're talking about vacuum cleaners at a security conference. The founder behind Dyson was not the first guy to create a vacuum cleaner that was built on cyclone technology to filter out dust particles, ironically enough. He, however, created over 5,000 different prototypes to try to test out cyclone-based dust filtering technologies, and eventually emerged with what he thought was a winner, and then went to market. He is a huge advocate, and he actually ended up starting this whole, I think it's a non-profit, officially a nonprofit, geared around helping people learn how to positively embrace failure in the creative process. Organizations or entities that do not have a great relationship with failure. So the healthcare industry, for example, there's a ton of things getting swept under the rug. If a patient sadly passes away on an operating table, everyone wants to put the blame on somebody, and nobody wants to own up and talk about it openly. There is no such thing as a blameless postmortem in the healthcare industry. And so it leads to a lot of silence. Nobody wants to step up. And you could say the same thing about a lot of politics and government entities, but we're not going to get political here. So I personally feel like, and I mentioned AppSec as being, I think, somewhat different in a lot of respects, but I think in many ways the cybersecurity industry has a not so healthy relationship with failure. And so we are very much all about blaming the users. We're very quick to hang a breach on the CISO's head and get them out the door. You'll see Twitter erupt anytime that something happens. The users are stupid. They need to go. Blah 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 blah. And it's really bad. And we kind of push people away. And I don't think that we do ourselves any favors in learning whenever something goes wrong. Alternatively, the bad guys, I think, fall into this much more healthy relationship with failure because they are very much they're motivated by achieving some objective. And if they don't get it, they come right back. They come right back. They come right back, and they get better and faster and stronger and smarter. And they will keep on cycling until they get what they want. And then they'll keep on cycling, and they'll squeeze us for a little bit more. And so they know how to iterate. Maybe not all of them, but in general, I think bad guys or gals, bad entities, adversaries, have a much more healthy relationship with failure and learning from failure than do the cybersecurity industry as a whole. So that is my quick rant about failure. Circling back to our kill chain overlaid with the udon noodles, we have on here, if we want to start thinking about where we can apply deception technologies, considering how adversaries step through and learn from failure, I think it makes sense. One way that you could look at this problem, if you are considering adopting deception in your environment, is to try to find ways to strategically place it within your organization to serve a specific goal. And you can run tests with these sorts of things. It doesn't always have to be in the same places. But maybe you throw off reconnaissance by pushing out some misinformation. Maybe you throw off C2 by having like proxies in place that can delay things, that can monitor things. There's a number of different things that you could do, and I'll touch on those just a little bit later. I have like a little toolbox of sorts of just one-liners that you can take and try out. But think about what you're trying to actually achieve with deception, and then experiment with it. So, with that, I think as a whole, when we're thinking about deception as a capability, we need to have some kind of strategic plan backing that capability. You wouldn't come into an organization and say, we need application security, and so we're going to take the off-the-shelf AppSec capability and we're going to drop it into this organization. You wouldn't do that with incident response. You wouldn't do it with monitoring and alerting. There are things that you can learn from and apply in your unique context of an organization, but you wouldn't just drop the cookie cutter thing on your org and expect it to be successful. So, does anyone have any idea what this is a picture of? Because I think this is a very fascinating example of why strategic priorities and planning matters in deception. What's up? No, that is not it. Any other guesses? It is World War II. So this is a bunch of Allied forces within World War II working on code breaking regarding the Enigma. So, okay, all right, my bad. All right, never mind. Gentleman back there was also correct. So, tell my hearing is so good after all that metal music. All right, so this is I think a perfect example of strategic deception at play because the Allied forces broke the Enigma, and that allowed them to basically eavesdrop on Nazi messages as they were being sent back and forth. However, they could not actively act on the intelligence that they were getting from those broken messages. And there's a great book about this called Bodyguard of Lies. You can find it on Amazon. It's a 2-volume part. I have a references thing at the end that you can that has a whole bunch of books and papers and stuff that you can dig through if you're interested. But they could not take action on this critical insight that they were getting. So they had to basically sit on their hands and watch things happen in some cases. And they had to be very selective and intentional about the actions that they did take relative to the intelligence that they were getting. And because if they did act on that intelligence, Nazis would likely have found out that the Enigma was broken. They would have changed things up, and then they would have been back at square one. The adversary would have quickly adapted, and the Allies basically kept them in a state of suspension by not actively acting on the intelligence that they were getting. So, with that in mind, three main things. So deception needs to be intentionally designed, placed, and invested in, managed through the lens of broader strategic objectives. So you have to know what in the world you're trying to accomplish, why you're trying to accomplish, and you have to make sure that that is in alignment with other security controls that you're focused on within your environment. Deception is not the only thing that you should be doing as within a security program, or else you are probably going to find yourself on the front page of the Wall Street Journal someday. It's not going to be good because there's a lot of other things as a part of resiliency that you should be investing in. Next thing, ask yourself the question, are you using deception to aid control, prevention, detection, or response? Or a combination of all of those things. It doesn't have to be one or one of the others. And then deception is not just a tool or appliance. Just like application security is not a tool or appliance. Just like embracing a DevOps-like culture change is not. You don't go out and purchase three items of DevOps and then drop it into your environment and voila, you're off to the races. No, it's a capability. It's a culture change, just like deception is, I believe. So I'm gonna talk through two schools of thought really quick, and then I have the more technical little toolbox, if you will. So the first one, Maskirovka, is the Russian school of thought around deception, and it's built on 5 main principles. And this you could go online and read about and study this, but this is the kind of stuff that you'll see them actively do in, for example, the recent Ukraine conflict. They are concealing their actions. They go in, they take action against their adversaries, and then they get on public TV, deny like crazy. Nothing is happening here, while in the background they're just needling away until they get what they want. And so these 5 principles that it's built on: concealment, imitation, simulation, disinformation, and demonstrative measures. Basically what I tried to do here is have a cybersecurity-like corollary to each of the principles that these were built on. And I'm not just gonna read through those things. So the reason that I chose the Russians in this, give me one second, is they have a very unique blend of thinking in terms of military and political strategy. So they're obviously right next door to China. China has a methodology or school of thought all to its own, and that is actually on the next slide. But Russia has a very almost like a hybrid approach of Western-based thinking, which is very in-your-face, smack dab, get it done, surprise-oriented, and Eastern-based techniques, which is a little bit more focused on indirection and concealment. And they blended together very, very nicely over history. And there's a ton of amazing, biographies and military studies and stuff like that you can read through if you want to learn more about that. The second one, so 24 characters. This is actually Deng's 24 characters, which was a national security strategy document that came out a couple decades ago, and the 36 stratagems. So I pulled out a few elements of both of these two doctrines, if you will, deception doctrines from that are kind of held up as pillars of Chinese deception thinking. And as you can see, it's very, very different. So the Russian form is very much focused on offensive measures. So they are going to conceal their actions. They're going after and actively intimidating somebody. They're applying misdirection in the form of simulation and disinformation, and then they're taking other measures. The Chinese Eastern school of thought is much more drawn out. It's a little bit more low and slow. So as you can see, we have things on here like maintaining a low profile, really being intentional about utilizing power positioning or position in general relative to your adversary, and acting very calmly through situations so as not to stir up excitement about a particular, as though you've like stumbled onto something important, for example. Let's say if you were to take some political action against a Chinese resource, and they are following this sort of school of thinking, they may not get very excitable and all of that because they don't want to lead on that you are onto something that is very, very important to them, as an example. So onto the more technical measures, and I have a lot more ideas on here that we can talk about offline, or we can tweet back and forth or email, but it's running out of slide space and I didn't want to bore everyone with a bunch of bullets. So we have very commonly applied deception techniques on the left here. So sandboxes, honeypots, or honey things, connection delays, returning false information, stuff like that. And the things that are not so common that I think are a little bit more interesting to consider is applying the honey concept to things like people, to customers, to files, to databases, to entire systems that are very much they look like they're a part of the environment, or you name things a certain way that they sensitive things appear unsensitive, non-sensitive things appear sensitive, that sort of stuff. We can keep our deception controls that we are layering throughout our environment moving. We don't have to place a honeypot in one place, and that's the only place it stays until the end of time as adversaries are actively learning and figuring it out. We can use some of the same moving target, DevOps-like easy deployment methodologies that we're using to bolster and advance AppSec to advance these sort of capabilities. We can also start to layer honeypots. If we do want to go with the honeypot approach, because there's a lot of active tech and stuff out there, you can layer them in a sense that let's say you have 5 honeypots that are on your perimeter or in the DMZ or whatever. They're working their way from the outside in. You may want to take, thank you so much. You may want to take active action on some of the ones that are very, very obvious, only to lure your adversaries into thinking that there are others, or that they have found all of them, and that once they've identified those, they can proceed a little bit more freely, as an example. So we went through the kill chain and the OODA loop a little bit earlier. Another way I want to present to you guys as a possible way to think about this is layering deception controls outside, from the inside out, from where your assets actually lie. And obviously you're going to have more than one asset in your organization, but it could get really complicated to represent that in a more complete way. So layering deception controls from the inside out. So if you think about, let's say you have healthcare records in a database somewhere in AWS. There's a set of servers that can communicate with that. There's a set of servers that can communicate with those servers, and then there's maybe like an SSO infrastructure. There's some users. There's a VPN, stuff like that. You could work your way in a concentric fashion out from the inside out, and then you could kind of plot this out. If you wanted to, maybe you want to have certain forms of deception on the outside and other forms closer towards your assets that are maybe you want to start blocking closer to the assets, or maybe you don't, because you want to just rely more heavily on exfiltration controls and use the deception to aid in attribution, for example. Like, that is something that you could consider in your broader strategy. So it's completely contextualized. So I'm going to wrap up. I've got 2 slides that are very much more thought-provoking questions, and I'll just rifle through those really quickly. So this is pertinent, obviously, to your strategy that you're developing in the HyperCon. Is what options are available to us if we know that our deception has been discovered? We may want to just invest or kind of continue on as we were and rely on other security controls to do do what they are intended to do. We may want to take that down. We may want to leave it up and then deploy other deception controls around it to increase the sphere of resiliency that we have in place. And I think the answer to this is just outright no. Blocking or stopping is not always in line with the bigger picture that you may be striving towards. But it's worth stopping and asking yourself the question, because your tools that you're getting on the market will push you down that rabbit hole. And just keep that in mind with regards to the kinds of adversaries that you're working with. And if you are working in an organization that is operating on more of a national level, critical infrastructure level, where you're interfacing with DHS, things like that, so big financial services, healthcare, other things that have been labeled critical infrastructure, then attribution efforts is something that's really, really important to the DHS if you're sharing intel, that kind of thing. So it's another angle to consider in this broader strategy. And then next one is, if you are mapping out the kinds of adversaries that your organization is going to be actively sparring with over time, I think it's worth considering how culture affects deception techniques, or just the way that people think about deception. And so that's where we can think back to the Russian and China, the delta between the Russian and Chinese school of thought, which is way different than the American and very, very Western school of thought. And you could think about this through a very simple example of like the death by 1,000 cuts way of targeting somebody versus the surprise camouflage attack to take somebody down. Both methods of attack, both methods of sparking conflict, can be very, very damaging and can get the job done. But it's worth asking yourself, which is more damaging over time? It depends. And then, of course, you should just always ask yourself, like, if you're considering or sparring with an adversary, is deception even at play? Because they are, of course, afforded all the same options to be just as creative and slippery as we are. So, with wrapping up, 3 things to keep in mind if you are interested in getting started with a deception capability at your organization. And I can talk offline with people, because I don't want it recorded, about what we are doing with deception capabilities at SourceClear that you may find interesting. Yeah, just come up and see me afterwards. But first things first is to lay out and define strategic objectives that matter to your particular threat model, your particular organization. Depending on the assets that you're protecting, the type of industry that you work in, this is going to differ from environment to environment. And that's why that cookie cutter approach does not work. Not that they can't help, but they are not going to solve your problem, just like there is not an AppSec tool, an AppSec appliance. Next thing is to quantify and learn about the types of adversaries that matter to you, that matter to your business. So you don't have to be tracking down APT groups as they're, pushed out by FireEye or Cylance or whatever threat intel group you kind of subscribe to. This is more, you can bucket them into archetypes. You may be worried about advanced persistent threats, to throw a buzzword at you, or advanced targeted threats from a particular part of the world. And you can ascertain this from looking at your logs and seeing what countries are hitting you the most frequently. And you can kind of just create a general archetype of the kind of adversaries that you're worried about and that matter to your organization, and work backwards from there and design deception controls that kind of align with those particular adversaries or classes thereof. And remember that in the beginning, doing less is more, and this is just general principle for life. Try to do just one thing at a time. Don't drop 1,000 things in and think that like just peppering your environment with 1 million bits of deception is going to be effective, because I really think that just like if you're developing and rolling out a static analysis capability, dropping it in and running away and expecting it to work, you're probably going to really, really struggle. You need to place it intentionally. You need to invest in it. You need to have process behind it. You need to have standard operating procedures. You need to have people who know about it, can manage it, can nurture it, can change it, can enhance it, can upgrade it over time, things like that. So invest in one thing at a time. Less is more out of the gates. because if it's obvious and you drift back in, if you drift from the con to the hypercon, then you're dead in the water. And these are some of the resources that I mentioned earlier. Again, these slides will be available. So the first one I think is really, really fascinating, and the first two actually capture the Chinese school of thought very succinctly. I know the title, if you're worried about ending up on some blacklist somewhere, don't buy the first one. But they talk about they talk about basically stirring up conflict through all of these different angles, coming at an adversary from an economic, supply chain, military, societal influence perspective, like coming at them from all these angles and just trying to stir things up and create churn. And then they go in for the kill after all of that, and amidst all of this chaos. It's fascinating. And then you've got some of your other, your typical things. I mentioned Bodyguard of Lies earlier. You've got The Prince, good old Machiavelli, Sun Tzu's Art of War. Black Box Thinking is a fantastic read, all geared around failure and the culture of learning around failure. Most Secret War is by R.V. Jones, or it's a biography of him. And that is, he was this military scientist for the UK, for London's military during World War II. And he was just always coming up with crazy off-the-wall ideas. Stratagem is more of a general military deception book written about American strategies. And then there's a ton of good, solid published guides online about Chinese, US, all sorts of countries, just putting this stuff out there as they become declassified and such. And the keywords I think to look for, obviously deception, information operations, psychological operations, gray zone warfare, and red teaming. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone here and to the organizers, and I will take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you. Very nice talk. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
I was wondering if you might have a few words of advice for those of us who really like what you say, but have to convince our management or C-level executives that A, this is legal, and B, this is not going to look, quote unquote, bad if it comes out, because you list things like deception, cyber ops, gray warfare.
Yeah.
I know better. Those are fine. But the rank and file and frankly, your chief executive officer, chief financial officer, or your OGC lawyer might not agree with me. So do you have any suggestions on how we might navigate that minefield?
Yeah, well, I think that's where starting off small is really, really important. And you wouldn't want to necessarily, I don't think anyways, start off like by creating fake people at an organization that I worked at in the past. We had like 10 fake employees, and we would like stir things up on social media for them. And basically how we use those people is anytime they received any kind of email, is either sales or it was phishing. And if it was phishing, well, anything that they got, we would just take and put into an email filter and then do something else with them across the org, like see who else was emailing them, that kind of stuff. But I don't think you necessarily want to jump straight into the deep end with things like that, but start really, really small. And don't make sure that you are correlating any control that you're proposing with the value that you're going to get. So, maybe the corollary value is aiding security monitoring and response. Maybe it is making this particular application a little bit like it's a hardening exercise, things like that. And talk about the potential reduction in risk, and frame it through the business lens, and don't focus so much on the fact that it's big scary deception. Focus that it is just another form of security control, and here's the value that we get from it. So I found that to be like generally good advice for just about anything I want to do in an org. So yeah, good question.
Hey, great talk. So I've seen this in organizations, and it kind of depends on the size of the organization. But how do you make, whether it's honey items, honey tokens, whatever it is, attractive for an attacker, but deal with that signal to noise of what I would categorize as like friendly fire, or your people tripping over it. So
Yeah.
oh, this looks super interesting. I'm going to click on it, and then it's like, Carol, this is the fake. You clicked on it again. So
Yeah. Honestly, that is a very, very good question. I think so. I think signal to noise is just one of those inevitable evils, depending on where you place something. Like if you, let's say, create a tripwire of a file, for example, that's accessing that file. It might be, instead of advising them that it's a form of deception, maybe you advise them that, accessing that kind of file might be outside of security policy or something like that, and frame it in a different way. Because A, you don't want to like tip your hand and let that potentially get out there. But B, that's why I also think it's really, really important to start really small and be super intentional about where you put anything. Because like you don't want to A, have a bunch of stuff that is potentially ineffective, and B, overwhelm your SOC with a bunch of stuff that is not, false positive, friendly fire, so to speak. So, yeah. All right. Cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.